College football nerds, we are talking what in the world is going on with the defenses in the SEC. We just saw Ole Miss put up almost a 50-burger on Alabama. LSU's defense gets shredded again. Florida's defense gets just annihilated in a loss, and we want to talk about it. So Josh is with me. We're going to break it down a little bit and talk about what's going on this season. And I want to, Josh, open with something that we pride ourselves on this show in being consistent. We're known as being SEC homers or whatever. We're actually really objective in that regard. But for years we've said, and I'm going to share the tweet that I tweeted. This one was me. Josh always says the good ones are his. This one was mine. Basically talking about how for years we've criticized, rightly, the Big 12. And yes, good offenses have come out of the Big 12, but bad defenses exist across the board over there. Some years TCU or Iowa State might play a little defense, but otherwise bad defenses. And Big 12 fans always said, oh man, come on. You're just, they play bland offense in the SEC. And once this offense comes there, your defenses are going to melt. And you're going to see that it's the good offenses, not bad defenses. Well, I'm here to say the defenses are bad in the SEC. Josh, back me up here. Let's break this down a little bit.
When you look at the passing defense, in particular in the SEC this year, it's kind of striking how the striation of it settles down. So along the 14 teams, you've got only four teams allowing less than 8 yards per attempt. Georgia is tops in the conference. That's unsurprising at 5.2 yards per attempt. I think what is surprising is Arkansas at number 2 at 5.6, Mississippi State at number 3 at 6.6, and Kentucky at 4 at 6.6. Everybody else is 8 or above. A&M and Ole Miss are averaging over 10 yards per attempt allowed. LSU is allowing 9.5, Missouri 9, Florida 8.6, Alabama 8.4, Auburn 8.3. Those are just kind of shocking numbers. And so let me put it in perspective a little bit. Let's rewind to 2011. No SEC team in 2011 allowed over 8 yards per attempt. Not one. The worst in the conference was Ole Miss that year. They allowed 7.6. Alabama led the conference at 4.3. Your average team in 2011 was Vanderbilt at 6.3 yards per attempt. So, right off the bat, okay, your average team in the SEC in 2011 would have ranked third in the conference right now. And your worst team in the SEC in 2011 would be ranked 5th in the conference right now. So that's how stark, at least statistically, the differences are. I think there's a lot of things that go into it. I think it may be somewhat a shift in offense. It may be a shift in philosophy for how the offense has to be focused. Certainly has a lot to do with the changes of the rules. And I think something we need to talk on is how the game has changed since, say, 2011. But it's not just your eyes, right? And it's hard to unpack. How much is the SEC just worse as a whole? How much of it is the game has changed? But regardless, the on-field result, the amount of yardage being given up the game is just radically higher across the board than it was just a decade ago.
Yeah, and we can't forget COVID. I think that's part of it as well. I think some of it, and I want you to touch on this a little bit too, because we did talk about this in our season previews. A lot of teams were replacing a lot of guys. LSU is one of those teams for the last decade that's had a really good defense, if not elite defense in most years. And we called it this summer. We said, this defense, y'all, it's going to be decimated. And it turned out to be true. Alabama's replacing some guys. Still should have been better, in my opinion. There's some, I think, legitimate argument that Pete Golding needs to go. I want to throw some numbers out here for you, and I'm looking on my computer because I don't memorize all this. Josh, I want to give you some numbers, and I want you to just kind of digest them and give me your thoughts on if this is just elite quarterback play, elite offensive play, or there's some real concerns with defense. Alabama put up 63 on Ole Miss. Mac Jones was 28 of 32, 417 yards, I think 4 touchdowns, 13 yards per attempt. The guy almost lost. Kyle Trask, 23 of 32, 312 yards, 9.8 per, 4 touchdowns, did lose. All right, Miles Brennan, 29 48, 430 yards passing, 9 yards per, 4 touchdowns, did lose. Can you remember a time in the SEC that this kind of thing was not only happening but common?
The short answer is no. Um, it's not. And I throw out 2011 numbers, okay? So let me be clear. No team in 2016 allowed 8 yards per attempt. And that was with 14 teams in the conference, right? So that was after Johnny Manziel. That was after the RPO kind of got brought into the forefront 2013-14. That was with guys like Lane Kiffin revolutionizing Alabama's offense and had been there at that point in his third year. No one was doing this. I think, like you said, I think there's a couple things in play. One, COVID has drastically impacted the defense's ability to perform. Um, in conference play, even last year, all right, there were only 4 teams in the SEC that allowed over 8 yards per attempt just last season. I don't think the SEC, every single team in the SEC got that much worse, right? We went from 4 teams in the SEC doing it to 10. I do think COVID has really caused issues because what I'm seeing a lot in all these games is a lot of busts. I'm seeing a lot of missed tackles. And a lot of times in spring, that's when people really get the basics of their scheme. They get their assignments down. Like last night, really throughout the conference in a lot of games, you had a lot of bad weather. You had a lot of guys losing their footing. And when you're a step late doing what you need to do and you lose your footing, you let a guy go and you give up huge play. Explosive play after explosive play after explosive play in several different games that were played. Even the Auburn-Arkansas game, which didn't have a ton of offense, had a lot of weird explosive plays happening. You take that and you compound it with the fact that I think quarterback play and RPO play has become even more of a component. The past 4 years, I think Alabama with Tua Tagovailoa and then what LSU did last year in 2019 made the RPO kind of be the forefront of the conference, has also made it that much harder to defend. And I'll bring out a point, right? Several years ago, when I think it was after maybe the 2013 kick six, and I don't remember the exact details, but I remember it sticking out of my mind. Saban had this long rant in a press conference about, is this what we want football to look like? Do we want to allow, and I'm pretty sure I think it was the Iron Bowl because they got away with a pop pass in that game that set up, tied the game and put Auburn in a position to win. Like, do you want football to be this thing where these rules are allowed because the defense can't do normal keys, right? It used to be if you see a lineman go downfield, the running backs the safeties would crash down because it was a run, and if the linemen don't go downfield, the safeties knew they could drop. It makes it a lot easier not to blow your assignment if you can key off the lineman in that way. The RPO has taken those reads out, and it's now way harder in the defensive backs to know what's going on, particularly the safeties, which is why you're seeing so many safety mistakes. They have to read the offense in a way that teams didn't used to. So I do think, even if not every team is an RPO, it's changed the way, there's enough RPO teams out there that it's changed the way defense is having to be taught. And because of that, it's getting a lot harder to teach it. And it's harder to teach it this year in a year where, again, you have COVID. So everybody was a lot worse than they were last year. I think the combination of those two things is making defense collapse. And I'm going to touch on one more thing. I know I've gone on a long segment here, but I want to point out, as much as we talk about defense being bad, right? It really is just the pass defense. There are only 2 teams in the SEC allowing over 4.5 yards per carry right now. Vanderbilt and Ole Miss are allowing 6.5 and 7.3. They're sort of uniquely atrocious. Everybody else in the SEC is allowing under 4.5 yards per carry. Arkansas is the worst at 4.4. Georgia's the best at a measly 1.5. But even like South Carolina's 3.2, Tennessee's 3.3. Nobody's really allowing a lot in the run. It's the pass game that's been brutal. And I do think it's a combination of how the RPO has changed the way it's defended and the defenses this year without spring training having to be coached up to defend the RPO in a much more complicated scheme and much more complicated reads and not having the benefit of time to do that.
I think that COVID's having a huge impact. And this is where I'll give the Big 12 a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. We've seen the Big 12, especially in that opening first and second weekend, struggle in ways and against teams that they don't normally struggle against. We give them a hard time for defense, but they don't normally struggle against out of conference, lesser teams. We saw Oklahoma do to Houston and UCLA what Alabama does to, conference opponents. So I do think that you can look across the board and see where COVID has really kind of wrecked defensive preparation. And a lot of it is just fundamental tackling because they haven't had a lot of contact practices, especially missing the whole spring camp and then having just such an upheaval this summer. It is interesting. But look, Georgia's playing defense. Clemson's playing defense. There's a handful of other teams out there in the country that are playing defense and had to operate under the same kind of constraints. So I'm willing to concede a little bit on, I do think better offenses across the board. And what the RPO spread has done is it sort of democratized offenses where you don't just have to have elite talent. It kind of makes, it brings a balance into the teams that have lesser talent and aren't as good, can still put up some points against some defenses. So I'm not saying it's got to be 2008 where I think Alabama led the nation in defense and they allowed like 9 points a game. I'm not saying that. But we've gone from 9 points a game to Alabama giving up 48 last night, and I think Ole Miss scored on 5 straight possessions. And here's the other thing. They're not kicking field goals. They were touchdown after touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. So I think that there's something weird going on. It might be a combination of personnel. I think it's a lot COVID. Josh, I want you to touch on this because tell me if you think this is true. I think 10 years ago, if COVID would have happened, the defenses would have been ahead of the offenses. I think given the offensive schemes that we're looking at now, it's flipped, and that COVID or any kind of event like COVID that would cause this kind of upheaval in consistent practice, the offenses are across the board all ahead of the defense.
I agree with that. And I actually can give you an explanation that I think is pretty simple. I think it's the changes in play calling and scheming that were brought in by Gus Malzahn and then really built on by Hugh Freeze and Lane Kiffin that have really changed it. Teams don't huddle anymore offensively. And you look at a guy like Matt Corral, right? And, you wanted to have this discussion, and I watched a condensed version of Alabama. I just rewatched it looking particularly at their pass defense. I was struck by how freaking talented Matt Corral is. And I know it shouldn't come to as any shock to anybody that's like the Kentucky fans or Florida fans or Alabama fans, I'm sure. That dude's an NFL player. But I watched Ole Miss the past couple of years. I mean, he got benched for Plumlee for a reason. And the difference is they're running a hurry up, no huddle play call from the sideline offense. And last year when they had a much more huddle based offense and Matt Luke was running the show, he didn't know how to run that offense at all. And he made terrible decisions. But now the coaches are calling the play and they're calling the read from the sidelines. And frankly, the players don't have to know as much and they don't have to understand as much at the quarterback position and at the receiver position or what have you. They basically have to memorize the signals and memorize what their route or read is based off that signal. And a lot of times it's a one route play or a 2-route play. I think that's why it's flipped. If this was still the huddle era where the quarterback goes through multiple reads, I think you'd have a very, very different conversation, particularly with quarterbacks that often transfer or whatnot, don't have a lot of experience. But in this no huddle era where all the stuff's being called in from the sidelines, it puts that much more strain on the defense because they don't get to huddle and they have to be trying to get plays at the last second to get lined up at the last second. And it makes it way easier on the offense because they don't really have to do much more than say, okay, I line up I've got a smash route and I'm the Y. Okay, cool. And you line up and you run the play. And you may not know anything else about the concept really. And I think that's really changed the way the game's played, and it's made it much, much worse on the defenses in this COVID era.
Okay, so I want to wrap this up because this wasn't meant to be too long, just a little treatise, if you will, on what's going on right now. But let's talk about just this season, because I think if we have a full off season, things might look better next year. And I do think, like everything, it's an ebb and flow where sometimes the defenses are ahead, sometimes the offenses are ahead, and over time they will adjust across the board, even in the Big 12. But just for this season, Josh, Give me your opinion on whether or not this is something that teams like Alabama, LSU, Florida are going to be able to adjust and get better on their defense by the end of the year, or is this something that's going to take a whole off season of retooling to really get people and personnel good to go on the defensive side of the ball?
I think you'll see it be about 50-50. Last year, I think almost famously, LSU's defense last year looked totally unprepared to start the season. And they were extremely talented, as we saw in the NFL draft. And they turned that corner during the year with Dave Aranda. Last year, Alabama's defense was out of sorts early in the year. Now, they had a lot of injury issues, but even despite that, a lot of those injury issues existed at the beginning of the year, and I don't think they were any better late in the year than they were early. In fact, I think in many ways they were worse against LSU than they had been like week 2 or 3. And I think you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see some teams that get better and some teams that get worse. I think any team that suffers injuries during the season, or any team that sort of finds themselves playing from behind, their guys are going to get more instinctive and reactive and panicky, and they're not going to trust their scheme. Defense, you need players to be instinctive, but you need them to be instinctive within the bounds of the scheme and muscle memory. And if teams are constantly struggling defensively, and we see this with Oklahoma, guys get really bad habits and they never learn to trust the scheme, and they almost get worse because they get in the mode where they're like, I just need to react and do something. And they're constantly running the wrong direction. And given it's an all-conference schedule, I think a lot of teams are going to get in that boat. I will say this too, a lot like LSU, teams like quite possibly Alabama or Florida that are in a position where they can score enough points to bury opponents are going to be in a better situation because the defense isn't going to be as strained. You're not going to have the situation like Alabama and Ole Miss all that often. And they're going to kind of get better as they get in those blowouts, and they're calm and they work on it and they get yelled at and screamed at, and they'll improve. Teams like LSU that are going to be probably in shootouts throughout the year, they may have more struggles. They may not necessarily improve this season because the defense is really never going to get their feet under them enough to be learning on the fly.
All right, y'all, that's it for our discussion on what's going on with the SEC defenses. We'll probably revisit this at the end of the year just to see if things turned around or if it was kind of a lost year for SEC defenses. We're going to talk about Alabama and Georgia in a preview this week. So we'll probably continue this discussion of how bad Alabama's defense played against Ole Miss. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.